Welcome, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to have you all here to the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, BCDI, our Small Business Field Guide webinar. My name is Michael Partis. I'm the Executive Director of BCDI, and we're very excited to have you all here today for this important webinar on small businesses and some of the pathways to shared wealth and thinking about the recovery in our communities. So what you'll see on the next slide So BCDI is a community-led economic development organization. So for us, we really focus on economic democracy, and three important ways that we ground ourselves in that is movement building, our community enterprise network, which makes up 6 infrastructure projects, and a people-centered approach to planning and development. So we're really focused on community solutions, on innovation. We are sharply intentional about developing, growing, and connecting Bronx businesses to new opportunities. And I think more overly important that we train leaders across sectors to advance a more democratic Bronx economy. And so for today, we want to begin, and you can see the agenda in front of you. But today we want to begin just to give the context of the Bronx and small businesses. Then we want to get into some of the thoughts on principles for a just recovery and for thinking and practicing economic democracy. From there, we'll go into some of the details of the Small Business Field Guide, which is what we want to feature today. And then we'll recap with our next steps together. What are ways that we can engage, co-design, and plan? First, we just wanted to take a moment to have a short moment of silence and reflection, just to think about and in remembrance of what our community has gone through in the recent months with COVID, and also as we continue to fight racial inequality. We wanted to take a moment of silence. So we thank you all for that. So one of the key ways for BCDI is to think about what if we owned it? So what is community ownership of decision-making of land and community use of it? And also the overall decision-making structures for the important institutions in our neighborhoods and our communities. What if we prioritize ecosystem that invested in human dignity, that fostered community well-being, and moreover, importantly, supported movements for self-determination and freedom? In 2011, BCDI began with those questions of what if we could do each of those things? On the next slide, those are long-standing questions, right? And so BCDI deeply draws on history. And if we think about the pursuit of the Black freedom struggle, and we think about Black determination, these questions around self-determination were very critical. These aspects of what is economic self-determination happens coming out of the legacy of sharecropping, of enslavement, of plantations and Jim Crow. What if we can reorientate a society that is based on these kind of principles of possession and move towards a community-minded focus where the people closest to the result are actually making the decisions, where the people closest to the result are in control of the direction and the outcomes of our institutions and structures. And so for BCDI, when we talk about movement building, we think about it from that historical perspective, and what you see in front of you now, we also think about how that bleeds into the contemporary. And so some of the legacies around, the opposite of community control and the type of economy that extracts from our neighborhoods and alienate them, one important way is we see that in urban areas with redlining. So from redlining, urban renewal, processes that not only were intended to economically disadvantage our neighborhoods, but also to remove our neighborhoods from the control and self-determination that we have identified as a long kind of struggle in the United States. We just begin to think about the detrimental or harmful results of those processes of segregation, those processes of white supremacy. And so for our what if, not only is it historical that we connect and co-design and build from the legacy of Black liberation. But we also think about from the urban planning perspective, what are, and community-led movements, what are the different ways that we can reimagine our communities with our control, and what are the ways that we can make them more democratic. So on the next slide, an important part of this history is tapping into the legacy of community organizing and justice work that has happened both on Fight Back, as we often mention, and Fight Forward. And so we know that coming out of the 1970s, there are a long history of community organizing for justice, for community control, for local control, and for building the type of structures that BCDI envisions, for thinking about power sharing, importantly, for thinking about Black liberation and the empowerment of working class Black and Latinx residents, and to think about shared wealth, right? How do we change the economic conditions? And so coming out of the 1970s and the kind of destruction that the Bronx see, we know that an asset-based approach recognizes that, in fact, that there are strengths and assets and important community organizations and residents that we rely on. And one of the biggest ways you see that here is, if you think about the 2011 moment, was the Kingsbridge Armory struggle and the Jerome Avenue rezoning, where importantly, community groups came together and stakeholders came together to think about a different process, right? What would be a different process for making critical decisions about economic development in our neighborhoods? Who determines the value and the use value of those entities and those decisions? And more importantly, how do we build a process that not only has the participation of the local stakeholders and key residents, but actually is power? How can, both in the Kingsbridge example and in the Jerome Avenue rezoning example, how can we leverage power to the communities and have them as a part of self-determination, community-led planning, and governance? How can we draw in and change the process? And Kingsbridge Armory and Jerome Avenue rezoning are two examples of communities, of our local Bronx community coming together to do this. And on the next slide, we think about that, how would that kind of process, how does it relate to our year so far? So we've seen some dramatic changes that we think are important for us to think about what our borough has been through historically and what to look out for, but equally, and perhaps more importantly, to think about how can we take those lessons and move together to rebuild the recovery that our communities will need. How can we make sure that it is equitable, it has power sharing, it has community governance, and that it increases shared wealth. One thing we saw so far this year that you can see on the slide in front of you is really the consideration that the COVID pandemic and the shelter in place policy that was put in, how has it affected our local economy? And what we know is that many businesses, what they experienced from the shelter in place in the pandemic is it brought up real questions around demand. So as demand, what in the economy will be the demand for the supplies and services, as that became uncertain, equally, we know that the pathway for supporting those businesses also became troubling. And ultimately, with the uncertainty, there was still a definite, which would be that these local businesses still had bills, right? So still trying to meet the need to keep their operations open and to adjust to what the pandemic entailed with changing policy on social distancing, on what can be open or not. There's a severe crisis that our local small and medium-sized businesses faced. And equally, as that crisis of the economy unfolded, we also saw the amplification of the movement for social justice and really thinking about Black liberation, as we saw many instances of community protest and community movement building. And so how do those two things come together as one? On the slide in front of you, you see the second kind of consideration is what are the policies in place and processes to support our community on, one, the economic aspects of this recovery, survival and recovery, and second, how will that happen with institutional support? And one thing that we saw is a tremendous amount of the business relief, both the PPP loans through the federal government, as well as the city, local agencies, SBS. We saw that there was a dramatic challenge for the Bronx businesses to receive that funding. Data from the spring shows that only 3% of the PPP money made it to the Bronx, and only 2% of local government money made it to the Bronx. Bronx local businesses. And so beginning to think about if there was a crisis around health and how it impacted our economy, we also needed to begin to think about how do we support our local businesses and what kind of system and structure would create more resilience. And so in that way, I want to pass it over to my colleague, Evan Futterman, and he'll pick it up on the third piece, which is the evictions, and also take us into the small business context. Evan?
Great. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so as Michael's sort of laying out, not only are there longstanding historical trends that we're seeing surface in this moment, we're seeing nationally and even globally sort of generational moment of reckoning around the role of race in society, and especially in New York City, the role of race in our built environment and how it has created neighborhoods of opportunity and neighborhoods of oppression, encircling communities of color and blocking communities from being able to access capital markets on equitable terms. This is now an intersecting crisis that is unfolding for small businesses at the same time as we're seeing another wave of a housing crisis unfold. So what we're experiencing right now is the removal of a moratorium on evictions that is going to particularly hit places like the Bronx quite hard, and so the small business challenge, the economic challenge, the challenge of instability, of stress, which is an extreme contributor to poor public health outcomes, especially in the context of systematic racism, that these crises and these challenges are mounting and connecting with one another, that they're not isolated. The challenges of a small business owner in the Bronx is linked with the challenges of a renter in a stabilized housing unit in the Bronx as well. And so then the question for us is, how do we think about return to normalcy or return to stability? And for us, as well as many others, it's of course quite clear that we really don't want to go back to the status quo that existed previously. The status quo might seem more stable to some, but in all honesty, of course, and in clarity, that this status quo was unsustainable and was really challenging for many small business owners, residents in the Bronx. Since many of you are from the Bronx, a lot of the sort of baseline snapshots, statistics that we wanted to showcase may not be particularly new to you, but they do help set the context, I think, for what we mean when we talk about a Bronx-led or a community-led recovery for the Bronx specifically. Sometimes folks ask us, well, why is it important to think Bronx-wide? Why is it important to think about the Bronx as a whole? Why not think about New York City? When I think about the whole state. And of course we do, and we are, but the Bronx as a borough, and indeed any borough in New York City, is a city on its own. And this won't be surprising to those of us who live here that we're 1.4 million people. But for those folks who don't know the Bronx very well, including perhaps maybe some of even our own legislatures from other parts of the state, we are similar in size to Philadelphia, to San Diego, and Dallas. And that, means that we deserve a set of resources and a set of planning and a set of thinking about what our needs and assets and resources are. That is not just the thinking about how do you resource a neighborhood. 42% of Bronxites are born outside of the 50 US states, which, is on par with all of New York City as a city of immigrants and of recent immigrants as well. The Bronx has the highest concentration of public housing in the borough, as well as the largest cooperatively owned housing developments and the largest worker-owned cooperative in the United States. So the Bronx has a lot of significant, which I use plus signs really to indicate that the Bronx has a lot of some of the best and biggest in the city, as well as some of the challenges. So we are the youngest borough, median age of 33, which is about how old I am without giving away too much in the level of specifics. But we also have a challenge around youth unemployment, extreme challenge around youth unemployment that right now is being exacerbated by threats to SYEP, as well as other funding and budget cuts to some of our municipal services. There are as well also significantly high poverty rates as well for youth that really encourage us and implore us to make progress on how we think about youth employment, not just for the summer months, but overall, in catching young people as they emerge from high school and either choose pathways to college or community school or technical and trade schools for employment. Something else important to think about too is that, at least as far as back as 2018, the total number of businesses in the Bronx is pretty substantial, 18,000 businesses. And really the thing I think that's most important, most critical for us to really hold on to and lock in on for the Bronx business context and for the recovery context and opportunities for transformation is the fact that 2/3 of Bronx businesses have fewer than 5 employees, 80% fewer than 10. So we're dealing with a borough of micro enterprises, hyper-local small businesses in which people are really working together quite intimately. These are not large corporate structures. Of course, we have large institutions in the borough, but the overwhelming majority of folks in the Bronx are working in a small business with under 10 folks. This is an important statistic here. I just wanted to give some context for this. Often when we talk about jobs in the borough, we use, about the number of jobs overall in the borough, but those could be jobs that employ people who don't live in the Bronx. Sometimes when we talk about employment numbers in the Bronx, we're including all workers, but those are also people who could be working outside the Bronx as well. So for example, 560,000 Bronx residents were employed in 2018, but they could have been working anywhere in the country or in the city. 313,000 workers were employed in the Bronx, but they could have lived anywhere. And so we own in specifically on this statistic of 131,000 people, both living and working in the Bronx, to signify the size of our village, right? The size of our small business village, people who live and work here in the Bronx. And of course, these are statistics that will also be familiar when we set the context, right, of a $37,000 median household income. The numbers around this vary around this range. And that, of course, again, to connect back to housing insecurity, housing instability, and rent burden, 6 in 10 Bronxites paid more than 30% of their income towards housing. And of course, right now, in the COVID context, of course, we're likely dealing with substantially higher numbers and more rent burden than that. At the same time, as Michael said, we have to be very clear that we do not define ourselves solely in terms of our challenges and our deficits. And the Bronx congressional district race, the primary election for which is held today, is often referred to as the poorest urban congressional district in the country. And I think, without ignoring the challenges that the Bronx faces, it's time for us to really reframe how we present ourselves and think of the Bronx congressional districts as potentially the most powerful congressional districts in the country. We've seen what it can happen when leadership from the Bronx emerges on the national stage and how powerful it can be for setting the tone for the country. And so yes, challenge, but not only challenge. And we think about this in terms of hopeful contradictions. This is a phrase we use somewhat regularly to describe the fact that yes, challenges exist, but we are not solely defined by them. And at the intersection of these challenges and our assets, we have opportunities to transform our economy. And this is particularly true in the realm of small business development, in which many small Bronx business owners feel neglected, ignored, forgotten, particularly highlighting that dynamic in the COVID context, in which Bronx business owners mostly got attention after property damage they experienced on Burnside and Fordham in the last few weeks, when the mayor sent out emergency grants, which were substantially a substantial addition to the loans that were received by many small businesses prior to that. And so we see the kind of attention that the Bronx gets is often inadequate and on terms only that respond to our most dire predicaments and not to our aspirations and our vision for the future. And so what we want to think about is, how do we understand and characterize or contextualize what we think about as being necessary going forward? And this is where we start to get into what we at BCDI call this idea of fighting forward. Yes, we need to fight back against challenges and against precarity, against the things that are harming our communities, but we also need to be clear and visionary in our work for a different future. And so when we talk about principles and pathways towards economic democracy, towards shared ownership, towards community control, we think in this moment, particularly around essentially two different spaces, right? The idea of preserving local community economies from extraction. What we mean by this is that often in an opportunistic way, large scale, either real estate or corporate conglomerates and venture capital firms will come in and scoop up small enterprises and then sell them or repackage them or liquidate them in a context depending on what is most profitable. And we see that it's critical to protecting small businesses is that there's a competitor or a counter-cyclical actor from the public sector, from the community sector, that acts as a counterweight or another option to preserving community wealth by interceding in these moments to support and organize small businesses under a broader and different logic of ownership for supporting local and community economies. We also believe that supporting shared wealth enterprises and community governance of public goods is an essential part of both the short term and the long term. We're seeing this right now among advocates for removing police officers from schools, of police-free schools as a movement, as well as for reappropriating or transferring funds from NYPD in the short term and the long term for community needs. Of course, over the long term, we need not just this one-shot relief plan, likely that we're going to get from the federal government or from the state government, but also a multi-year plan from the Bronx for a just transition to economic democracy. If the status quo was unacceptable previously, we can't allow ourselves to become complacent with something that gets us back to a place that we were in before. And so in this context was really how we were thinking about creating these field guides. So we created 3 field guides. This is the first. The first field guide is a small business field guide to economic democracy. And we'll be releasing some of the others to deal with other Bronx stakeholders throughout the rest of the year. And the way we conceptualized it originally was a way to connect folks to pathways to action, pathways to shared analysis and understanding of what the challenges are and how to address them. Of course, the COVID pandemic and the uprising that we're seeing nationally and across the globe for Black lives and Black liberation is an additional confirmation of the deep necessity of significantly rethinking how we understand ownership in the Bronx particularly. And so the rationale then for the small business guide, if we just go back quickly to this preserve and support, the field guide really fits in right there. And we'll get into the expand and extend components of pathways to economic democracy towards the end. But this really preserve and support is really where the field guide is meant to specifically hone in on. So we thought about it as our primary audience, not just for the entrepreneurs themselves, of course, though obviously they are a key primary audience, but as well for the business support community in the Bronx, of which there are many. Many of you are on this call currently, including SBS and other business support organizations from across the city and in the Bronx. And so as we think about who is really involved in sustaining small business in New York, that's a large cast of characters, from government to non-governmental to community-based, neighborhood-based organizations, faith-based organizations. And yet out of that fragmentation, there also is a shared sense of purpose. And so we really want to have, especially for the Bronx, where this really small micro business community exists, folks thinking along the same page about how to protect and preserve this micro business enterprise, and also even potentially how to think about restructuring ownership at the small business and micro business level for a different ownership future, especially among business owners of color in the Bronx. Of course, the guide can also be used for those who are looking to learn more, who are interested about local planning efforts, including LDCs in our neighborhoods, community boards, other neighborhood organizations, and of course, for those of you who work with youth and young people, absolutely feel free to use it for how to understand what the potential future of small business ownership and entrepreneurship in the Bronx can look like. The way we chart out the guide, and we'll provide a link to it immediately following this webinar, the way we chart out the guide is really in a concentric circle framework. So the way we think about this is that when we want to speak about economic democracy, we aren't just talking about what happens at the level of the single business, right? We're not just talking about, well, economic democracy means that you convert your business to a cooperative or to an employee-owned business. And of course, that is fundamental. It is the first step. We're talking about how business is done at the level of the firm. We're also thinking about it as it extends and expands out through the broader community. So we think about how cooperatives and democratic enterprises and small businesses can form networks for collaboration and resilience. These are particularly important and have been demonstrated around the world as essential, not only for sharing the wealth and the prosperity in good times, but especially for sharing resources and information and support during hard times. This resilience thing has come up as absolutely essential, of course, in the context of COVID. And then, of course, broadly towards the larger systemic changes that are needed to put Black and brown business owners on an even playing field with equal access to capital and growth opportunities. So as we get then into just sort of a slightly deeper understanding of what we mean by teamwork and solidarity in business practices and management, something that's really critical, is an old management quote. This is a Peter Drucker quote back from the 80s or so, famous management consultant, sort of like a rock star for a little while in the 80s and 90s, which is this idea that culture eats structure for breakfast, which means even the best designed cooperative structure, democratic structure, cannot function as such if it does not have a interconnected and mutually supportive culture of participation and shared ownership. And what we mean by ownership in this sense is a shared voice, shared purpose, shared understanding and roles and responsibilities of how to govern the enterprises. And so at the core, at the nucleus of this concentric circle model that we're using as a device here is that there's really only so far you can go with a structure and a design, and that it really is incumbent upon us to think through how to design for democracy, yes, at the level of the firm, but also how to reinforce that at a daily level, daily practice. And so participatory management practices, cooperative business practices are culture shifts in many cases, not always, but some cases are. And you might find with businesses that you work with that many of your small businesses, even though they are technically structured as an owner with employees, that there already exists a collaborative and cooperative structure. And that restructuring ownership to change the nature of that collaboration, the structure of that ownership, can actually be a relief and enhancement for small business owners who often feel overwhelmed. No one is helping them. They can't handle it all by themselves. We've spoken to a number of small business owners who think about their own role and participation in carrying the load of running a small business by themselves, thinking about how to share greater responsibility and ownership with their employees as one way of preserving not only their business, but also their own sanity, their own mental health, their own sustainability of their work. When we get to the thinking about expansion and scale, there are a number of different ways, and the guide will take you through a few different approaches. We use a table, a sort of rubric of approaches that you can grow democratic enterprises. I think the way I often speak about it is that cooperative enterprises in our current city environment or hyper-competitive, individualistic, small business entrepreneur environment often exist in a sort of dog-eat-dog world, and New York City often prides itself on how much hustle and how tough we are and how we can make it on our own. And cooperatives throw a wrench in that style of thinking, and as such, they also then occasionally appear as sort of illegible or hard to understand for traditional sources of financing, particularly venture capital, which often demand an extremely extractive rate of return on the companies that they approach and take ownership. That's in addition to the structural racism that we all know have seen has been embedded in traditional venture capital models favoring investments and entrepreneurs that are typically white and typically male. And so this part of the guide really gets into how to think about growing through networks and collaboration. There are a number of examples we use, including a franchise replication model, which has been in the works and has been being iterated around, as well as an umbrella cooperative or an umbrella cooperative conglomerate model. So these are some really interesting ways of thinking about how to take businesses that are typically quite small, aggregate them together to overcome certain challenges of economies of scale. We also get into, in this part of the guide, different ways that this financing can take place to support these kinds of collaborations. The outer circle, of course, is to speak to the broader sense of systems change, right? Which is that even if your businesses are successful, in order to fundamentally transform the conditions that Black and brown business owners face in this country, Black and brown communities face in this country, that this cannot be accomplished without broader structural and systemic change. That racism will persist and pervade so much of our daily lives, all of our societal institutions, without broader shift. And small business owners in our Bronx community are absolutely a part of that shift and that change that must happen and must take place. And so in the guide, we speak to the question a little bit here and getting examples of how small businesses have engaged in social change efforts, have joined in community coalitions, have joined in their own advocacy efforts through a variety of vehicles. The one thing that we really want to just shine a light on in this case is that social enterprise is good, and we support broadly the best intentions of, the sort of best version of what we understand social enterprise to be. But social enterprise is not in and of itself social change. It is not sufficient. And when we think about economic democracy, we really have to think about a deeper sense of shared ownership, shared responsibility to one another. And so the guide goes through examples of how small businesses have been a part of addressing that change, and also how they can think about new ways of participating in that change alongside community, alongside social movement, ways that they can think about their allyship and their own leadership as well. And just really important to remind ourselves that as we seek out a more democratic, a more equitable, and a free society for Black and brown people, that democratic enterprises are a critical component of that. And in fact, they can add to and mutually reinforce our broader goals for equity. They can model that kind of equity on a day-to-day level, that can practice democracy at an everyday level in ways that we are typically not exposed to. So we think about some possible pathways. This is where we start to get to the sort of broader examples of approaches to systems change, to advocacy, to the sort of, if you go back to our framework on economic democracy, the expand and extend, right? This is an example from California where a business alliance proposed a $10 million recovery package that would specifically target employee ownership transitions to save small businesses where the owner maybe needed to retire or needed to restructure, but wasn't willing to go through the lengthy process. Maybe they were close to retiring, maybe they weren't sure about their investment, but you have to invest resources beyond the city level, at the state level, to really leverage and find and sort of draw out of the woodwork all of the potential businesses that could be included in such a venture. And you also have to really invest in the due diligence as well. Often what has happened in the past, and where many people, especially unions, have a negative view of employee ownership, is that corporate shareholders and executives have turned to employee ownership as a sort of bailout for themselves. In other words, they have taken on the investment of the ownership transfer and left a failing company that's in shambles to the workers, who then are stuck at the end of the stick. And when we talk about pursuing an employee ownership strategy, we have to be absolutely clear that we are pursuing sectors that are viable, sectors that make sense in the regional economy, and individual businesses that also make sense within that context. It's another example of, in our nearby neighbor, Massachusetts, of the Black Economic Council of Massachusetts, which just yesterday published this Black Mass Coalition. And I encourage you to visit this, the links that we'll send out at the end of the webinar, where they are making substantial demands, uniting small business advocates and community organizations to make substantial demands on the private sector, the public sector, and philanthropy to essentially invest in Black recovery funds, to invest in Black businesses, to invest in minority-owned businesses as part of recovery, and explicit investment from those sectors. And making a set of targets around that. This echoes Philadelphia's recent efforts just in the last week to prepare specifically a Black economic recovery package as well for the city of Philadelphia in the COVID context. So these are some of the examples of how we can think about not just directing aid disproportionately towards minority and women-owned enterprises, or MBEs or MWBEs, but specifically towards shared ownership enterprises in those communities, in which we're creating broader shared ownership among communities of color, not just for individual entrepreneurs. And some possible pathways that we advocate for and that we believe are part of the solution and that we're already have been working on for the Bronx and for New York City specifically are a combination of some of these, in which we see a really strong potential role for reconstruction corporations or holding companies, a model that we mentioned previously in the guide and that we draw attention to in the guide, specifically because of how small the businesses typically are in the Bronx, that holding companies that are cooperatively owned themselves can be a great way of sharing ownership and sharing equity at a higher level of value than just the individual enterprise. There's a really great example that's used about Duracell Battery Company, in which the Berkshire Hathaway, the venture capital firm owned by Warren Buffett, owns Duracell Battery is a wholly owned subsidiary Berkshire Hathaway. And so under this, essentially it's a holding company. So under this model of economic democracy, we imagined that, for example, what if the workers of Duracell directly owned shares and management in Berkshire Hathaway, their corporate owner. And so under a cooperative conglomerate structure, you start to see how ownership can be structured in very different ways, not just at the level of the individual firm, but broadly across the Bronx, creating broader cooperative corporate and community power. And ownership can be then mixed to include community members as well. These are called hybrid or multi-stakeholder cooperatives. And of course, we couldn't be talking about how to advance economic democracy in New York City and the Bronx without talking about land. Several organizations in the Bronx are advancing plans for permanently affordable community land trusts for residential, but there's also a Bronx CLT that is pursuing community land trusts for commercial and industrial and mixed use purposes, because our industrial and commercial spaces are also extremely vulnerable, and keeping them permanently affordable and stabilized for our small business and commercial corridors is absolutely an essential piece of preserving the kinds of small businesses that exist presently in the Bronx. We've definitely seen an expanded role for employee ownership technical assistance in cooperative development centers. This is similar to a bill that was sponsored recently by Senator Jamal Bailey, calling for an employee ownership center connected to the SUNY University, which is a model that's been used around the country for employee ownership centers to affiliate them with the university in the state. We also believe that there's substantial room to grow that from a single center to a set of centers that are co-located with existing small business infrastructure across the city and across the state. One that comes to mind is the small business development centers, which are chartered by both the state and federal governments to provide small business assistance. So providing training, business plan development for cooperative entrepreneurs, employee ownership conversion opportunities. These are all the kinds of work that can be done by a combination of nonprofit, community, and public sector resources. And of course, we also envision a Bronx-wide plan for recovery and economic democracy. This is work that we'll get to and explain in slightly, just a bit more detail in a few minutes, but really seeing a pathway forward that is about shared vision and a shared understanding of where we need to go in the future. So it's about 12:40 right now, and I want to just take a moment to offer up some space for questions. Just want to raise their hand or write in the comments. I'm going to just take a quick break, but also want to, as we create some space for questions at this moment, want to continue to move forward a little bit and just give some time for my colleagues to continue to speak. So as folks are maybe thinking of questions or contemplating what they want to ask, or maybe getting ready to type something in the Zoom chat, I will just say that for folks who have additional questions, one of the things we decided we wanted to do was arrange sort of follow-up opportunities to speak in further detail. And I think these webinars can be great, and of course we'll be recording and posting these slides, and all of the resources will be sent out. And we really just want to make sure that when people have a chance to continue to digest, and we can go through the guide in more detail, how you might think about using it. And so I just got one question, which I want to address, which I think is really important, which is, can you just share a little bit more about what we mean by economic democracy? And yes, happy to. So when we talk about economic democracy, we think very specifically about a question in our lives. And we started off by talking about community control over development in the Bronx. And what that draws us attention to is the fact that we experience the idea that we live in a democratic society every day. We're reminded that we elect our leaders and that we're supposed to live in a democratic society. What this kind of passes over is the fact that there's an entire sphere of our lives in which we don't expect a lot of democracy. And in fact, we don't often ask questions or think about where democracy is. Because if we were asking where democracy was in the economy, where democracy is in our jobs, in our workplaces, we might find out that the answer is there's not a whole lot of it there. And there are a lot of assumptions underpinning that. And we might ask for a place, particularly a place like the Bronx that has suffered from generations of systemic racism, who benefits from that lack of democracy in the economy? And so when you think about economic democracy, it's a framework. It's not one thing. We don't have one good, pure, simple definition, but it's a framework. It's a way of understanding and asking questions about who should be in control in society. So it's really important that we focus on the role of the participation of ownership, whose voice is at the table, who has power to speak, who has power to set the agenda, but also who's owning the wealth, who's owning the resources in our community. Where does it go? People who live in the Bronx are often told that the Bronx is poor, but the Bronx actually has quite a bit of wealth. It's that people in the Bronx don't own most of that wealth. And so when we think about economic democracy, it's a way of understanding why not? Why, asking the question, why not? What if we owned it? What if we owned it together? What would that change about our daily lives? What would that change about our ability to live lives of dignity, of well-being? And so this question of economic democracy is a broad one and a deep one, and small businesses and cooperative enterprises are just one part of that. So another question about the length of the field guide. The field guide is about 25 to 30 pages. The entire PDF is double that because the field guide is available in both English and Spanish. And so the PDF itself is longer because we decided to, rather than separate them out, include them as one package. So you've got both English and Spanish in the field guide. And when we share that out, you'll see that. Yeah. So I'm taking notes of some questions. I want to just move quickly to my colleague, Tim, who can offer some examples of next steps, since some folks are asking questions about next steps as well.
Great, thanks, Evan. Glad everybody is on this call. Really appreciate everyone taking the time today. My name is Tim Gamry. I'm heading up the Bronx Exchange, which is one of the core projects of BCDI, working with small businesses in the Bronx and the purchasing community in the Bronx, working to make those connections. And I just want to take a minute to kind of share with you an exciting update in terms of where we're going with the Bronx Exchange. We started off with the Bronx Exchange, more of a closed group within the purchasing small business community, B2B, focusing on procurement, and have been working with a finite group of businesses in the network, and through that process seeing how much support businesses really need, small businesses need to grow, to access bigger opportunities. And then here, of course, with COVID-19, just the need was, illuminated so greatly in terms of the resources that are available, and then the business's awareness of them, and the small business's ability to access those resources. So one of the new developments for the Bronx Exchange is kind of expanding what we're doing with a focus on building a large database and large information center of all of the resources available in the Bronx, and that are made available to small businesses that are in the Bronx, but the resources can be from anywhere. There's so many resources that have been popping up, whether it's funds or technical assistance, and there are already, as many of you on the call, partners of ours in providing technical assistance to businesses. But it's surprising how often businesses do not know what is available. They do not know what they need sometimes. So if we could build out a platform that brings that information together, is comprehensive, is timely around the funds available, the technical assistance is available, be really a single source of truth on that, leverage technology, leverage data aggregation, and then customize that user experience. So thinking about the small businesses and where they are on their journey. So it's not just enough to just provide and dump hundreds of kind of opportunities, but like, how do we, through the platform, assess where businesses are, what they need, and then more strategically direct them to those resources that are available to them in the network. And then the other thing that's, I think many of you, our colleagues have seen, is like we're all doing like work, but not necessarily aware and coordinated with each other, and like to really move forward, helping businesses at scale, bring about economic democracy, like building in coordination function into the platform so that business support providers, like many of you on the call, can have a tool and a platform to plug into to help coordinate with each other and to reach the businesses that need our help and support. So we're working on this next iteration of the Bronx Exchange, and we'll be launching that soon. And I'm going to be counting on many of you on the call to join, to log in. You could sign up now so that we could get you early access, and also for the feedback loops. It's going to be an iterative process as we build this out, but it's really going to be the foundation, the digital foundation for this ecosystem and for empowering economic democracy. So really excited to share that with you and to work more closely with you all too, for building this tool that is for the Bronx ecosystem.
Great, thanks, Tim. I'm answering a few questions, and as we've gone on, I want to also just give a quick moment for Catherine to talk about ways for small business organizations and businesses themselves to get involved in being advocates for a better future for the Bronx and building power in collaboration with community. So this is a question that's come up from a few of you, both privately in messages to me as well as publicly on the chat.
Yes, hi everyone, I'm Catherine. I lead the Planning and Policy Lab, which is another project of BCDI. We are really invested in building on the legacy of planning and policy development and advocacy that has existed in the Bronx, and also continuing to ensure that as these planning and development decisions are being made in our communities, that we are the ones really driving those decisions. A lot of the work that we've been doing most recently has been with the Southern Boulevard Coalition. A lot of folks on the call are part of that body, and that really was in response to what we thought would be the next anticipated rezoning. But folks really felt that in addition to not only saying no to the rezoning, we wanted to put forth our own vision of what should happen in the South Bronx. So I think folks who are on the call now, businesses who are interested in becoming involved in that process, we're in the middle of developing that community plan and continuing to engage folks around priorities and needs in the South Bronx. And we really see that as part of a broader effort to really address the systems failures that we've seen for generations. We recognize that, again, in order for us to really combat these really large generational challenges, we need to have a shared Bronx-wide vision of where we want the Bronx to go, and a process that allows us to get to a plan for equitable economic development rooted in the values of economic democracy, that allows us to really understand the ways in which us as residents, as business owners, as anchor institutions, as labor, what is our role to really build out that vision of equitable economic development in the Bronx. And so we're really excited to start engaging our partners and more folks to really think about how to have these conversations with your networks, with your communities, with your neighbors, so that we can create this plan. And the primaries today, there's many more races to come for city council and the mayoral race. And so really wanting to also leverage these opportunities to put our vision and plan forward for folks who are gonna, be in power and represent us, so that they're clear that this is what the Bronx is demanding, and really building for ourselves for the future. So, any questions about how to get involved, please email me. My information's on the screen.
Thank you, Catherine. And just one thing I wanted to just bring everyone's attention to, these links will all be available in the PowerPoint we sent out so you can access them. This is a rapidly changing, shifting, I'm reluctant to say cutting edge because sometimes that has negative connotations for people, that it's a fad or something. But I do want to just draw your attention to the fact that since we shut down production on the guide to move to finalizing it and getting it ready for release, numerous articles, webinars, just in the last several weeks have come out that I was desperate to want to include somehow in the guide, but I had to discipline myself to make sure that we were able to actually get the guide out instead of just adding more and more resources. Set of other resources, guides, webinars, events that some are in the past, some are upcoming. And so just another set of examples, we'll be happy to send these out to you. And these are just things that have shown up in the last few weeks. So this is a constantly changing and growing field that is happening right before our eyes. And so since we do have a few minutes left, I want to just maybe, since there are a few final challenges, or a few questions, sorry, that have come up that I want to bring. They're being sent to me privately, so I want to bring them to the whole group. So for example, someone just asked, what are the biggest mental blocks or misunderstandings that people have about economic democracy? This is similar to a question I got, that we got just a little bit before from Lisa Marie, which is that people, do we find that people need to work on a shift in mindset or belief, and that so much of it is about where they're coming from or what they've been told is possible? And my answer to Lisa, which I think was public, yes, but what I'll add on is that we see a lot of diversity. So in the Bronx, we see people who come from extremely different walks of life, different countries, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and different faith traditions. And what we try to do in the guide and how we try to approach it generally is that cooperation and care are just as much a part of what we have always called, human nature, as greed, self-interest. They are parts of us. We build institutions that focus on care. We build institutions that focus on cooperation. We also create institutions that focus on greed and self-interest. So we contain all of this in ourselves, and the mental block is a result of conditioning, our educational institutions and our system. And what we find often is there are just as many people who are deeply inspired by the belief that something is possible, something different is possible than what they have been told. And we also do find skepticism, people who say, no, I've been told that there's only one way that the economy works. And this whole democracy thing, blah, 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 it doesn't work because people are selfish and nobody cares about anybody. And so countering those narratives that people tell themselves, one thing that's critical is the example. So like the question that Lawrence was asking about what are the concrete examples is very powerful. Showing them in the real world that it works and has continued to work for generations is really powerful. And also that people just may not know. We also have to be prepared for the fact that, this isn't for everybody. Some people want to run their business a certain way. But we do believe that there is an opportunity for a tremendous amount of growth across the world. There are places, urban regions across the world where cooperatives account for millions of dollars annually in urban economies, where tens of thousands of people are employed and co-owning cooperatives, where cooperatives contribute substantially to the regional economy, sometimes as high as 10% or in the teens of the GDP of a regional economy. And so I think about those opportunities of just lifting up what is possible and also what is a part of human nature, and having those conversations about where people see those values in their lives already and why it's so hard to believe that the economy might be constructed differently. This last question from Greg, I think maybe I want to hand off to Catherine. It looks like that was sort of I don't know if, I'm happy to take that on as well.
Yeah, and I think this is an ongoing conversation. I think part of what initially comes up for me is that the RFP, like this is a specific RFP for MWBE developers, right? But how do we create an RFP process or a system where we're constantly and systematically incentivizing developers of color, developers that are mission aligned and are really interested in working with community members to ensure that whatever is being built is actually reflective of the needs of the community. And similarly, how do we ensure that nonprofits, CLTs, all these folks that really have those values embedded in how they work, and the fact that they're embedded in community are actually incentivized to get the, be the ones to get these projects. So I think that's part of the conversation, and really working with the city to rethink that RFP process, so that it's not, so that we don't have to rely on these kind of one-off opportunities that are focused on folks that we think are aligned, but that the RFP process in and of itself is really reflective of working with partners that have the needs and priorities of communities in mind.
Great. There is one more question before we go. Many people are looking to engage with Black and Brown owned businesses in the Bronx at this time, especially those that are good to workers and restore and support community. Does BCDI, through the Learning Center or through the Bronx Exchange, foresee that being an initiative we could lead? I think we'd be happy to talk more about what that might look like. Would be I don't want to speak for Tim, but anything with businesses is for sure going to involve the Bronx Exchange team. But I think there's definitely a need to spread the love a little bit more broadly across the Bronx. What we have noticed and what someone actually wrote in their RSVP survey, which I think is something for us to talk about, is that some small Bronx businesses have gotten a lot of attention and a lot of hype and a lot of focus from outside audiences. And obviously we want to encourage attention and focus on the Bronx, but often that has been a little bit at the expense of thinking more broadly about how do all of our small Bronx businesses benefit from that kind of attention and from those, what we tend to call sort of, values-aligned consumers or values-motivated consumers, and residents too. How to organize those who would see themselves that way.
Yeah, I would just double down on what Evan just said. I absolutely want to surface those businesses, values aligned. Absolutely, like we want to shift the values of the marketplace. So we will be surfacing businesses on the website in the new iteration.
Saving the best for last, I see, Rhett. Thanks very much for that question. We have a final question, a deeply political and necessary question, which is these values can pose a strong challenge to the status quo and the ownership as it is currently structured in our country. It can also pose, as we've seen with Black Lives Matter and numerous other social movements, it can also pose an opportunity for those seeking to co-opt or take advantage of people's affinity for values that they believe are good and right in the world. So how can we anticipate and or prevent this is something that cooperative movements and social movements have been addressing and trying to grapple with for generations. I don't want to pretend like I have new and better answers than anyone of the ancestors and luminaries who've come before us. But the answers that generally have come from that, and this is, I think, where we'll leave off, is that this example may not be everyone's favorite, but because, well, maybe I'll use the example of South Africa, actually, instead of the United States. When South Africa was coming out of apartheid, it created a new constitution. Created a constitution in which there were, I believe, I lived in South Africa in 2000s, but my knowledge could be a little bit rusty. It created a new constitution for a multiracial society. It created a constitution with 11 official languages to represent the diversity and the heritage of everyone who lived in that country. What we're trying to do with economic democracy is write a new charter for how the economy works, how we relate to each other, a new social contract. And what you see in places that have been most successful in growing solidarity economies and cooperative economies to scale, where they impact the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and generate hundreds of millions or billions of dollars in economic activity and substantial political power, is that they start with a charter for their values and their proposals for action. And the charter gets embedded into public life and civic life in some way. So a charter for a solidarity economy that charts out a different logic for how the economy is supposed to work, who's supposed to be involved, who's supposed to be at the table, and who's supposed to control. We often skip over that because we're very eager to make change. And so we advocate for policies and we say we need these resources and those are all essential. But we often skip over the fact that our proposals are positing something fundamentally different about how we believe the economy is supposed to function. And so taking the time to think about what are we actually proposing? What is our new social contract that we are proposing for the economy is something that we all have a stake in, and all something that we all, especially in New York City, the heart of the belly of the beast of our global economy, something that we should take seriously, and something that I think the Bronx has a lot of knowledge and wisdom to contribute to something like that. And so since we're at time, I really want to appreciate and thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And we look forward to being in touch with all of you. Please feel free to get in contact with us via email. And I will also continue we'll send out all of these materials to those of you who have submitted your email to us, and we'll take the conversations from there. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.